It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
It's been 6 months since Progressive Emma Mulvaney-Stanak began her 3-year term as mayor of Burlington. Her top priority has been concerns about community safety. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, we get her assessment on what's working, what's not, and her administration's strategy going forward. First, a word from our sponsor. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Let me start with, you're now in month 6. What have you learned?
This job is exhilarating, hard, and wildly unpredictable at times. And it is the best job I have held to date. I really feel honored to have received the support of so many folks in Burlington to win the mayor's job. And I feel really well prepared at this moment in time to bring my skill set forward for the people of Burlington. And I see really good things ahead of us for the city around how we can really come together. I think my collaborative leadership style is really a real asset in what the challenges are, how to really address and tackle the challenges facing the city right now. And I think a lot of what I've been offering both internally within the city around transparency and thinking about this as the opportunity to think about, well, that strategy hasn't worked, let's try something else. It's really been well received around city employees, and I even hear that out, what I call in the wilds of Burlington as I walk about. People have been really appreciative, by and large, around the things that they see we are trying to do to change the course of Burlington.
Okay, but that wasn't my question. What have you learned in the past 6 months?
I personally have learned a lot about the need to think about this as a team sport. It's a lot of challenges facing Burlington anyway, but leading a 700-plus organization essentially, it takes a lot of trust within my department heads, collaboration among the department heads. I have an amazing staff here in my small but mighty mayor's office. So I've really had to lean into delegation. And on a personal level, I've had to really lean into our village of folks to support the fact that I am a mom of 2 small kiddos to help make sure my household is functioning and that I'm taking care of myself so I can actually do this job well.
Public safety, as you've said, is obviously your number one priority. I watched the public hearing that happened last week, and I know you've said repeatedly that this is not a problem that we got into in one day and we're not going to get out of it in one day. What sort of progress do you think has been made in the past 6 months?
Well, I talk about it as community safety, as you know, because it's much broader than I think what people tend to think when they hear the phrase public safety, where it's just police and fire traditionally. And the reason why I do that is really because there's so many more complex public health issues that have arisen in recent years related to our emergency housing needs and the historic and disturbingly high numbers of folks who are unhoused and unsheltered, many of which are locating to the biggest city in Vermont, which is Burlington, as well as our mental health care crisis, where there's not enough folks able to access the kind of services they need. And of course, you add the opioid crisis and people who are living with substance use disorder of all different magnitudes, some with very acute SUD, and how do we support these folks? So there's all these additional layers beyond classic public safety. So that goes into community safety. The progress we've made, in May, I started convening what we now call the hotspots cross-department regular convening. They meet weekly. It engages about half of our city departments to look at actual locations in mostly the center core of the city that have had ongoing chronic issues, and that's criminal issues. It's folks who are setting up encampments. It's folks who are doing behaviors that are just not conducive to our community, and figuring out how do we interrupt cycles of especially criminal activity, but also making sure we're connecting with folks and getting folks the services who need them directed in that way. We started with the library, which is probably the most visual and familiar because that has been a chronic hotspot before we labeled it as such, long before I was mayor. we started to use that as a case study, like let's try strategies here and then apply that when behavior moves elsewhere. Because as in any community that's really tried this strategy, once you start holding folks accountable and changing conditions for which this becomes less of an attractive place to be doing those kind of behaviors, people move. And so they moved to the Marketplace Garage. That became another hotspot location that we started to move additional strategies. And not every spot is 100% the same because there's different conditions at the library than there is at a parking garage. And we, for example, at the parking garage, a strategy we did there that's different is we did have a private security contract with a company to do security in the parking garage because we don't have enough police officers to do that level of patrol. And I don't think that's the best use of most optimal use of police officers anyway. But that contractor was not providing the services that we needed. So we ended that contract and we hired the sheriffs. And the sheriffs have had a much more effective presence, consistent presence. It's been the same staff. They get to know folks. That's been effective there. So nothing is 100% solved because this is an ongoing emergent issue. And I think as the weather changes, behaviors change. As we do other citywide strategies like interrupting the drug trafficking, when we have a high-level bust, that changes behaviors temporarily in an area as well. We've seen this on Buell Street, for example, another hotspot where we had a lot of increased both open-air drug use going on, but also low-level dealing. There was a big bust there a few weeks ago, and that interrupted that cycle for a bit of time. So the biggest themes on this hotspot strategy that are working are that the fact that the city is being persistent, that the city is being consistent in these areas, and that myself as the mayor has a high level of expectation that every week I get an update through my staff about what's working, what's not working, and when something is not working, the continual question is, okay, so now what do we do next? That is a different change. That's a change from when I came in, when people would say, for example, well, we don't have enough officers, so we don't have enough officers. And I say, well, that's not going to change overnight. As we've really have started to understand and make more apparent to Burlington residents, there is a chronic issue of not being able to recruit enough officers throughout the state. Burlington's not alone in that, and throughout the country. So as we modify and adapt our recruitment strategies to bring in more officers and then also retain good officers, in the time being, now what do we do? And that is a big adaptable piece. The second part I'll say besides hotspots that is really moving things at a more accelerated pace is the hiring of our senior assistant advisor on community safety, Ingrid Jonas. She's been with us for about a month, and she is diving right in right now to work in both a coaching and an assessment kind of way with the city. So she is providing coaching within our department heads who are engaging in all those aspects of community safety I mentioned before, the public health elements, how to think about integration more than duplication or overlapping, how to support police and fire in how they're thinking about recruitment strategies, how they're thinking just even how we're using existing staff, asking those kinds of questions. And I sort of joke that Ingrid is able to talk police language and police talk that I will never be able to do as a former state trooper. And she also is well versed in public safety in general. So she's been a great asset already to our fire chief as well, thinking through our community safety response team, which is a CRT team that was this pilot program we've continued another year to really innovate around how do we do proactive engagement with folks who are at risk of overdosing, at risk of just having medical needs in the field, if you will. And she's doing this assessment that's going to help us put ourselves on a track of a more integrated and effective community safety system, which is my primary goal as mayor.
Give me an example. You talk about using strategies that work and that don't. Give me an example of a strategy that you applied that you thought would work that didn't.
It's a good question. So I think one piece that I thought would work more effectively, which we haven't figured out yet, is how to keep up with the cleanup of needle recovery in particular. And I'll go back to, it's not just the library, it's Memorial Block in general, because as everybody knows, Memorial Auditorium has been vacant for several years now. We put up a fence. I thought that would really help to deter, trash and folks putting up tents in that area. That has not always worked. So we've had to go back and make sure that we're engaging with folks and siting tents when necessary to move people along, because that is not an allowable place to camp. But also just the ongoing trash and discarded needle patterns are just a much more entrenched issue than I realized. And it's not as simple as necessarily having more needle disposable containers out and whatnot. This is really begging us to have a little bit more of an innovative thought. So I just actually last week had a conversation with staff. There are pilot programs happening in other cities. Boston has a mobile needle recovery unit. I really want us to look into that and see what else we can be doing, because there's two parts of it. One is we have to recover the needles more for just basic safety and public health reasons. But two is we have to also understand more of the data about where people are actually using drugs, because that data needs to be helping us inform where do we locate the overdose prevention center site. And I'm sure you're going to ask me about that soon. But we need to make data-informed decisions, and not from and not from other places that are not evidence-based and not based in the reality of where are people most using, so we can be most effective around bridging people to use the OPC, which will then allow people to hopefully access more services, build those critical relationships to get people one step closer towards treatment, and do what these OPCs have done in other parts of the world, which has successfully helped people with substance use disorder, dropped needles in terms of needles out on the streets in and around OPCs, and even more secondary benefits to the community.
And where is that discussion in terms of figuring out where to put that?
So we will have
and timing.
Sure. Yep. So we are in the middle of the zoning rewrite process to allow us to have the maximum flexibility within how our zoning ordinance is written. That process, will be done in October. And then we are about to post a project manager position to help steward the city's work for community engagement around where do we site the OPC and how do we engage with potential service providers who would actually do the operations of the OPC. So I would imagine by November, we will have hired this project manager and starting to kind of outline for the community how we're going to think about siting and engagement. I want to emphasize again, it needs to be data informed, and this does need to be located somewhere in the center city for it to be effective. When early on in my tenure in June, we have this monthly meeting, what's called ComStat, which was started many years ago by the prior administration and many community partners. In the beginning, that was a case management, opioid crisis kind of space for people to meet and strategize of like, what else do we try? It is involved into a lot of policy discussion and data, but also a lot of people with lived experiences, both family members and folks themselves who are in recovery or living with substance use disorder. And the number one thing they told me, because we had a meeting at the end of June, right after the veto was overridden and enabled Burlington to be actually a pilot site, the number one thing folks told me as I said, okay, we're about to embark on this, what do I need to know? They said, you have to place it near where people actually will use it. You cannot put it on the outer skirts of the city limits. You cannot put it off of the public transportation lines. You cannot put it further away from where you're seeing people actually using, because then people won't engage and use it. Among many other really wise points of advice for me, that one really sticks to know that we have to make sure we're placing this in the right place. So while the community will certainly have places of input and be able to ask questions, and we can think about where co-location makes the most sense, where are other sensitive places we should be thoughtful around, not perhaps putting it right next door. I want people to know, though, that we have to use evidence to make sure this is successful.
I'm wondering how you think crime is today compared to 2 years ago.
Well, we do track crime data, and a lot of those numbers are pretty steady. They're not increasing and I wish I had my notes in front of me with the specific numbers, but people can access. We have a great data dashboard. One of the great things the city has developed over recent years is a data division. It currently sits within our planning department, but we have a lot of this information on crime statistics available, and it's pretty transparent and easy to use, which is a great thing for the public. And you'll see in a lot of those numbers, which are included in our annual report for our police department and in other ongoing data points, is that a lot of the bigger crimes, aggravated assault, for example, and whatnot, are at in the same numbers as prior to COVID, 2019 figures. Where we have seen increases, of course, are in retail theft. Now, that number, I think, is important to put an asterisk next to, because I also know not everyone is reporting retail theft. And going back to just data points, we need people to report crimes. I understand the frustration around not always having police be able to respond. But we're in this critical moment of needing the public to also lean in and engage. We still need people to report, and we also need folks to be better informed, and this is part of our job to do as the city, about who do you call for what kind of help you're seeking. We, as part of my community safety forum a week or two ago, we put out an updated version of a basic who to call when and in what scenario, and basically what do these certain newer roles do. So what does a community safety officer do that's different than an officer? What does a community safety liaison do that's different than a police officer? What is the street outreach program that actually has been in existence for decades now through Howard Center, and what do they do? And so all of that, I've had a lot of good feedback on that piece, and we're going to do more of that because I need the public to know who to call, and I also need folks to feel empowered to still report crimes, because that also helps activate other parts of city government, including our victim services program through the Community Justice Center, which is a city division of CEDO, because there might be things we can be helping folks do. I think it's important for people not to feel helpless that the city doesn't care. We need to know, and then we'll send you the right kind of help. And while we continue to grow our officer ranks to a healthy number to make sure we're rising to the occasion of the most acute crimes. So I always look at those figures and take everything with a grain of salt, but I also know that the city needs to do more around racial disparities and also digging more into how things are affecting our youth. And our data doesn't cut that way yet, and that's one of the directives I've given to our data division so that we can continue to adapt what information we are collecting to better inform our policy. And that also includes not only, for our young people, but I want to have a real laser focus on guns and access to guns in this community. And because guns and drugs really very much overlap, when there's drugs involved, guns are often present these days. And so we really need to be gathering this kind of information so we can be making thoughtful policy.
I'm glad to hear you say that you're not just purely doing this by the numbers, because, and you mentioned this in the Public Safety Forum, as somebody who's lived in this city for 40 years, these stories that you referred to that have been on the news, talking about these sort of packs of young adults kind of roaming the city here in the nighttime hours and then accosting people. I mean, that's just a different level of crime than a murder or an assault, which are going to happen. I mean, that's expected. You have somebody arguing with somebody at a bar. But this was behavior that was really almost like out of Clockwork Orange. Mm-hmm. What's driving that, and how do you combat that? Mm-hmm.
What that tells me is that the adults in this community have deeply failed these young people, and we need to get to the bottom of understanding what has helped lead us to this place. Now, this isn't a few years ago, maybe 2 to 3 years ago, there was also another spike in youth-involved violence, gun access, that kind of thing. There was a bit of a concentration in our immigrant and refugee families in this community. And so that seemed to quiet down for a little bit, but it is starting to bubble up again. And because of hearing these troubling trends, I know there was a group of youth service organizations like King Street Youth Center and the Boys and Girls Club and Youth Build and the Burlington School District that had started meeting a few months ago called the Burlington Youth Collaborative. And I, as the mayor, I never want to overstep people, but I said, I think we need to meet and we need to start talking about how can the city be better informed and a very strong partner in figuring out how do we interrupt cycles of violence, how do we stop failing these kids, and how do we fill in what seems to be broken and what's leading these kids to do these kind of behaviors, roaming around downtown. I always kind of describe it as bouncing off of each other in their underdeveloped, mature brains and whatnot, and finding themselves into dangerous combinations of things. And so in that very first meeting, which was about a month ago, all the youth service providers and the school district really pointed out that when we closed down BHS, we actually disrupted schedules and rhythms and important programming in ways that really disrupted a lot of these kids' lives. And so, several of our programs sort of went to several different physical locations. Not everything is located in downtown BHS. So our Horizons program, et cetera, it's all sort of broken up right now. And now we're expecting kids to navigate a schedule through many different physical locations. Of course, COVID, any parent knows this, COVID has significantly impacted the mental health and well-being of all young people, period. And so a lot of these youth have also gone through multiple years of virtual learning, disconnection from critical adults who may be outside of their families. And there's not enough mental health providers. That's what these youth service groups really make clear. There's not only not enough mental health care providers for young people, there's not enough of those providers and professionals who look like them, meaning we don't have enough BIPOC mental health professionals available. We certainly don't have enough who come from an immigrant or refugee background, where there can be a lot more ease for which hopefully these young people would see people like them and be able to confide and disclose what they need to seek that support. So the mental health care piece is the big one. And then the other reality is the economics. A lot of these families are working class, they are immigrant and refugee. The housing situation for so many is usually living in conditions that are not big apartments. They're not big living situations, sometimes for sizable families. I mean, we're all young once, right? You don't want to be in your home if it's not feeling like a place that you have space and ease. But then on top of that, the economics of a lot of these households need these young people to be also bringing money in to help feed families. Simple, basic needs. And so when we give these youth no other alternative that's a really viable economic way to earn money, sometimes they're pushed to make not great decisions around getting into low-level drug dealing. You can make a lot of money quickly that way.
Right.
And then, as I mentioned before, guns are often where drugs are. And if you're already feeling stressed mental health-wise, then of course adolescence around status and whatnot, it does not. It's all actually quite logical to see how things are now playing out in our community. And as I mentioned before, this is a failure of adults. This is not a failure of the youth involved. And so it is an obligation of us to work collaboratively with our youth service providers and our school district and to figure out upstream ways to interrupt this violence, going back to even middle school level. Where are we failing with after-school programming? Where are we failing with not engaging these families in the ways that they need, helping to bring more affordable housing? I mean, there are several upstream strategies that will help. And then there's also the immediacy of engaging these youth to disrupt those kinds of behaviors in ways that are really bringing them in so that we never get to a place of criminalizing these youth. And that is why I'm so glad people are tending to use the wording of grouping, because some folks default to the using of the word of gangs, and that brings a whole other wave of really problematic racial bias into the conversation that will only further harm these kids. Because again, a lot of these kids are Black and brown youth. They're coming from immigrant and refugee families, and the last thing adults should be doing is adding that additional bias that is not accurate, because these are not organized gangs. These are not organized criminal activities. These are young people who are. This is their cry for help, and this is our time to rise to support them.
Okay, you say that this is a failure of adults. Let me push back a little bit on that. Oh, sure, that may be true to some degree, but at the same time, not all kids are doing this, and these kids are making a choice to go out and do this. So are you holding them accountable enough?
So part of the accountability is for us to show up as adults in relationship with these youth. There are a couple youth who I think, and I'm using influencer not in the pop culture kind of way in terms of influencing for certain behavior that's helpful for the community. A couple of them are getting into a place of more of hardened criminal activity, and they're influencing these other youth around them. So that's what I mean. They're not a monolith of young people, and some of them are on the cusp of being pulled into making more negative decisions. And that's where I will say that not enough adults are leaning in to be able to engage. What King Street Center told us is that we need, in particularly, more adults to be putting their hands up to be mentors, especially male-identified folks. We need folks to be able to offer different kind of programming in the community that actually matches the interests of these youth. I guess a pulp culture reference. There's a lot of creative, generative content creation that's a big interest among these young people. After the loss of 242 at the Memorial Auditorium and other pieces that have been offline for years now, there's not that creative space really for youth. And there's athletics and whatnot, but not everyone makes the team, and not everyone wants to do that kind of activity. So again, we have known that these gaps exist, and this is the time for adults to show up and provide these alternatives, and to let kids also show up as they are, to then start almost like in a harm reduction kind of way, to start rebuilding those relationships, because to me, it's a combination of both accountability but other options for which we need to be presenting them.
Go back to the library. When you looked at the issue of what was going on at the library, so how do you, as the mayor, How do you approach that? Do you write it down on a whiteboard? How do you figure out what to do?
Well, I do have a magical whiteboard in my office that's on wheels, so which every department head and my whole staff jokes about how much I use that. I used to facilitate for a living and organize people for a living as a community and labor organizer. Those skill sets, though, have been particularly helpful for convening these cross-department meetings and really assessing who do we need to have in the room, who's not in the room that needs to be in the room next time, really collaboratively problem solving and identifying what the challenges are. So again, as I described before, when we first sat down and talked about the library, sort of the initial response was, well, we just need to have more police presence. And then the police department said, well, we don't have enough officers to send. And then that clearly was where the conversation sort of began and ended, and then there was a pause. And I filled the pause because as a good facilitator, you want to provoke, okay, what comes next kind of thinking. We were able to then go to the next steps. Like what else can we be thinking about? Use other aspects of the Burlington Police Department, the CSOs, when an officer's not available. What are other things that the library could be doing to, again, deter certain behaviors? We eventually realized we had to take the bus shelter down because it was becoming a chronic spot where folks were sort of hanging out, camping, et cetera, and starting to block the entire sidewalk. And I think the other thing we realized in that course, because that was May, was that the library needed more strategic investment to be able to bolster their own internal security, but also hiring a social worker. So that became clear to me as we were building the budget for this next fiscal year. And I would not have known that if we weren't really hyper-fixated on this first hotspot to learn everything we needed. And then also know, okay, so it got better for 3 weeks, then this uptick happened. Why did the uptick happen? And whatever the activity would be. And then we would adapt a little bit more. People were coming after hours a bit more. So then we adapted and said, we're going to turn the Wi-Fi off, unfortunately, right? We don't want to have this be our permanent reality, but people were locating after hours to access the Wi-Fi. So when we did that, that changed behaviors again.
What did you do when everybody moved to the marketplace garages?
Well, as I was describing before, that's where we then did an assessment of, okay, what's not working here? And the private contractor that was there for security purposes was not cutting it. And so we broke off the contract and found a better solution, which is the sheriffs. We also shut down, unfortunately, some of the stairwells in the building to go down to one because people were hanging out and doing dangerous activities in there as well. We also made sure that we were supporting the parking service employees. I had a meeting a couple weeks ago with frontline workers in the city because I think that's another important element for me, not to just hear information through department heads, which is filtered, but to actually meet with frontline workers. It goes back to my labor organizing roots to say, how is it really? How can we support your mental health? This is not within your job description when you probably took this job 3+ years ago. And what else should we be doing? And they gave me some very tangible feedback that I'm not sure I would have heard directly, which was we have a charging station in the marketplace garage that has not been used because there's a part or something missing. So we expedited BED fixing that so that that location gets more used by the public more frequently because there's actually a working charging station, for example. Without that, it was becoming kind of like another gathering spot and location. We continue to adapt. That's the biggest theme on these hotspots.
As I mentioned, I listened to the public forum you had last week, and I was alarmed listening to Chief Murad talking about the recruitment challenges, the current number of officers staying in the mid-60s, as he says, and that in the past when there was an opening, you might get 200 applicants, and now you're down to about 50. What's going on with that? Why is that happening? And what are you going to do about that?
Well, some of this is a little bit bigger than a mayor or even a chief of police. However, as I said before, we can't just say, well, that's just the way it is, and we can't do anything about it. We need to be proactive. We need to innovate. I will also note that the similar things are happening in fire departments as well.
Yep.
I was just on the Vermont League of City and Towns annual meeting, and amongst their I'm a member now, the legislative priorities will be specific recruitment helping strategies legislatively to enable towns to look at firefighter recruitment and how can we incentivize people to locate to Vermont to take these critical jobs. It's an issue even in rural communities in the state. But back to Burlington and police recruitment, we invested an additional $100,000 beyond what we've normally been putting in our recruitment budget to do some more innovative thinking. We are exploring lateral options, so lateral transfers are helpful both in police and fire because it allows you to bring someone who has prior experience in either a police or another police department or fire department to move in and skip over needing to go through intensive training. It gets a police officer officer and or a firefighter on the street, if you will, much faster than if we were bringing people in brand new. Not that we're against bringing people brand new. That would be great as well. And we're also trying to look at other ways we can incentivize people to be here. But the other piece, I'm always try to be really clear as a former labor organizer, it's not just money that recruits people to come to a place to work and certainly to stay in a workplace. And Burlington certainly needs to understand that. We've invested a lot with significant COLA increases throughout the last few years in both police and fire, and yet we still have folks leaving and not necessarily people wanting to come and apply for work here. So that's where I'm really leaning on my two chiefs, Chief Murad and Chief LaChance. Chief LaChance is the fire chief, to really push on innovation. I'm actually appreciative that the City Council had a resolution a couple of weeks ago now talking about, I think the question was first around let's increase the cap, and I said, well, that's not single-handedly going to change anything. What is helpful in that resolution, though, was a much more itemized report back around what recruitment strategies are we doing, how are the numbers, how are you adapting? That's like my new favorite word. But how are you adapting? Like, we can't use the same strategies and expect different outcomes to happen. But back to being a labor organizer, I'm also very keenly interested in morale and understanding how do we pay attention to that from the rank and file of the officers and the non-sworn officer staff at the police department and the fire department, and how can we be doing better? I've had lots of rank and file conversations with folks. I've met with all the shifts at this point in both departments, and there's a lot of different pieces of feedback around what we are doing to help retain people. And I also think that Burlington needs to do a better job of telling our whole story. I think that the story out in the media tends to be pretty heavy-handed on what's not going right now in the Burlington, but if people are here in the city and coming to downtown, there's a lot going right at the same time. Both can be true at the same time, but when we too heavily lean on one side, that's what people Google and look for when they're looking at, hey, I've never heard of Burlington, Vermont. Do I want to apply for this police position? So we ourselves have to take charge of our own narrative, and this takes every department head, and it takes even community leaders outside of city government to be really leaning in on telling our more nuanced story.
Do you think the media coverage has been unfair?
To some part, yes. I think that there's a lot of media in Vermont are not owned by Vermonters anymore, and so I think that's a part of it. There's certainly a clickbait mentality out there around what stories will get more interactions. I mean, capitalism and selling ads are a thing in the media world. That's not new news, if you will. And I think that sometimes there's an over-reliance on the same tired story, and then not really talking about the rest of things going on in Burlington. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had thousands of people here in the downtown for the Pride Festival that happens every year, and Art Hop the day before. Thousands of people were in our South End and downtown having a fabulous time. I was downtown last weekend for UVM Family Weekend. It was the vibrant church street that folks have known from years past. So we have these moments and that vitality when people come into our center city and engage with great events like that and great weekends like that. And that's still happening despite what people might be reading on a WCAX headline.
Do you feel comfortable walking downtown at night?
I do. I actually leave this building late many nights, so I just by default I'm always doing that. As a woman, I always have my eyes up. Any female-identified, trans-identified person, queer person does that anyway, and I think it is just that's the nature of being on this planet and being unfortunately in this community. So I always have my eyes up, but I have not felt unsafe. I walk through City Hall Park every night to be able to get to my car. I have two small kiddos. I've lived in the Old North End 20 years. The other piece about this is that some of the things that people perceive as being unsafe have long been in the Old North End, where we've had drug dealers and we've had people using drugs, where we've had folks having mental health struggles and whatnot. I'm not certainly immune to it, but I'm more familiar with it, and I come from that place of that familiarity of having a lot more compassion perhaps than some other folks where this is newer, and maybe that people are still needing to develop their understanding about what really is going on with their perception of someone having a hard time. I also really appreciate, and I see the work daily of our street outreach workers for Howard Center and our community safety liaisons from the police department engaging with folks downtown. And so again, back to that response plan and that response public education piece, we have many folks who are diligently and daily engaging with folks who are struggling in the downtown. I bring my kids downtown all hours of the day. I mean, they have to go to bed at some time because they're 5 and 9. But I don't have any qualms at all bringing my kids downtown.
You mentioned media coverage. Some of it's been local, too. 7 Days just recently did a pretty lengthy cover story talking about it. They then garnered a lot of reaction from some of their readers. I think more than 100 people responded. One of the responses was, and talking about the homeless problem and some of the other ones you talked about, it says here, it seems like local leaders care more about the 300 homeless individuals than the 45,000 people trying to live safe, happy lives in our beautiful city. I disagree with the mayor when she said there's no one thing that will solve any of this because it would have already been done. The solution, in my opinion, of this writer says is to uphold the law and stop the normalization of drug use, theft, camping, and verbal and physical harassment. If someone's doing drugs in public, they should be arrested and thrown in jail. And there must be consequences for actions if someone steals or harasses people on Church Street. How would you respond to that?
I'm not even sure this person lives in Burlington. It was interesting reading those responses to some degree because what we have to really grapple with is a lot of failing systems all at once. And I don't agree that criminalizing behaviors is the solution. Incarceration is not the answer for supporting folks who have mental health illness issues or untreated substance use disorder. If people go into our criminal justice system and certainly into our prisons and jails, there are not treatment services there. People will come out hardened. They will come out and will have twice, if not triple, the amount of challenges with people returning to the communities. When I served in the Vermont legislature, I served on the House Commerce and Workforce Development Committee, and we really did a deep dive in one of the bills around our corrections system and what happens to Vermonters when they're in the system and when they come out. And we do a deep disservice to folks when we don't recognize that when people come out with a criminal record, that much harder to find employment, that much harder to find housing. There are so many critical barriers. That will only compound the problems for which Burlington has. And I have no interest in making the problems more difficult 5-10 years from now. I'm interested in making sure that we have a city that recognizes human dignity, that recognizes compassion. This, to me, is when Vermont is at its best, when we show up for people in need. There are a lot of failures on state government's level around the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program, which is otherwise known as the motel program, which has led to a lot of the increased number of unhoused folks and unsheltered people in our community. The vast majority of which are not causing harm. They are literally trying to survive on public lands here in Burlington. And camping is not a solution, is not something I say is a policy solution. What we failed to do as a state is have a just transition for folks who could not find affordable housing in the state. And everyone who is trying to make a go of it knows that one paycheck is sometimes making or breaking whether you get evicted from an apartment, and that immediately sends people into homelessness often, or at least into much dire straits. So I wish we could oversimplify it, that is only what accountability looks like. Accountability looks like a lot of different things, and it is not overutilizing our criminal justice system.
What about open drug use?
Open drug use is, so one of the things I encourage people to think about is substance use disorder, which is the phrase I always use because medical professionals, you need to understand this is a medical disorder for which people have. The drug supply has so much toxicity within it, it changes people's actual brain chemistry. And when you look at the science of it, and you look at any other disorder that people are living with, we have vast amounts of more compassion when we're addressing someone who has cancer or diabetes or whatever that might be. There's so many Vermonters and Vermonters who have family members or friends or coworkers who have had some experience with opioids or substance use disorder of whatever substance, that we are in a critical time to make a choice around seeing people and looking for harm reduction strategies and seeing people for the humans that they are, the Vermonters for which they are, and putting more tools on the table like an overdose prevention center or whatnot. To me, that is a solution that is a health-informed solution to move people towards treatment instead of looking at people who have all sorts of reasons that push you towards using substances, but other than looking at them as they're criminals. The people we do have to have accountability for and use our criminal justice system are the people who are taking advantage of these vulnerable individuals. And those are the traffickers, those are the high-level drug dealers that are out there. Those are the people who are causing the most acute harm and also taking advantage of these youth I was mentioning before, right, who are in an economically challenged situation where they have not many other economic needs, and they are taking advantage of these juveniles. And that is where our focal point needs to be.
Is the state's attorney's office doing enough?
Well, we are actually, for specific to drugs and drug trafficking, that is actually the U.S. District Attorney that we're working very closely with. I really want to give praise to the Burlington Police Department. We have a very hard-working group of officers who work closely with the DEA to really do high-level bust of drugs. We're at a historic number. Don't quote me on the amount of drugs we've seized, but it's the most ever in the last year or so. So we're working extremely hard. What the challenge becomes is that it's so much bigger than Burlington. As a rural state, we are very much vulnerable to a lot of trafficking that is coming from Philadelphia, New York, and it's requiring a much higher level of coordination within other states, other jurisdictions, to be getting to the sources of this. And this is much larger than a mayor or city council here in Burlington. So I disagree again with that writer. There are some systems that are much more beyond Burlington. They don't, if you look at per capita, the numbers of incidences, I think they're underreported, that are happening in the Northeast Kingdom, where there's gun-involved violence and drugs involved, and straight-up murders. It's higher proportionally per capita in other parts of this rural state. So this is a statewide emergency that really we need the governor and statewide leaders also engaging in.
You were at the press conference last week talking about the end of the hotel-motel program, and I know you have some concerns about that. The state's dropping the ball?
100% dropping the ball. I've been working on this for 2+ years, back when I was a Vermont legislator, when we started to exit people with no off-ramp, no transition plan. And we were trying to sound the alarm. There was a bipartisan group at the time that tried to use the state budget process at the end of June, this has been a year and a half-ish ago, to just sound the alarm that this is going to cause extreme harm to the individuals, primarily, and on a secondary level, unfunded pressure on local communities, especially larger communities like Burlington and Rutland, who would hold the bulk of folks relocating to be closer to services, places they can meet their basic needs. I often talk about, I grew up in Berry City. There is no public transportation there. There's no grocery store downtown. If I were unhoused and unsheltered, I would not stay in Berry City to try to survive. I would move to a place that's a little bit easier to get around and to exist. And so this has been a compounding emergency over the last year and a half, 2 years. It's been a predictable emergency for which we've been sending the state towards. And now we're at the point where the most vulnerable folks have now been exited out of the program at an alarming rate. It includes a lot of families with children in this latest wave in mid-September, children who are mostly under the age of 5. And even the city of Burlington has been getting calls from around the state from families saying, where can we go? Where can we camp in Burlington? And while Burlington did open up some campsites at our North Beach campground, because we happen to own a campground, that's only until October 15th. And that is not a solution. It is not a humane response to have 3-year-olds getting ready to camp outside, people with medical conditions, people in wheelchairs who need electricity and other things to support themselves. These are not people who camp normally. This is just a completely failed policy moment. And this means that the only solution at this time, until the adverse weather program starts on December 1st, the only answer is to reopen the motel program in the interim, because anything other than that is it's just really it's an inhumane and turning your back kind of moment.
Well, and this was not just the Republican governor doing this. This was also the Democratic and progressive, overwhelmingly Democratic legislature.
Well, I would argue that most progressives were fighting against this as the former House Progressive Caucus chair.
Well,
yeah. And the majority of Democrats did certainly vote for it. And there wasn't, I was asked this question at the press conference, there wasn't another coalition fighting against changing this policy at the end of last session. I left in April. I'm not saying this is about me, but I was saddened to see not at least some resurgence of similar leadership from folks to, again, just sound the alarm, if nothing else, in this debate. And there are many reasons why, but I think that this blame can certainly be shared by multiple folks on the state level, and that is an important point. And at the same time, I'll say, as a fellow now executive branch leader in this state, when the legislature, which is part-time, goes home, then it becomes time for an executive to step up into a moment, especially one of emergency, and be self-reflective and admit when perhaps this was the wrong decision to make, and then make it right.
But there were people, Brenda Siegel, other homeless advocates, John Walters, who writes a column, has written dozens of stories about this. People were raising the alarm, and the legislature just wasn't going along with it.
And I think there's a bit here around, I think they thought that they offered $10 million of one-time funds to stand up emergency shelters, but that's not enough. And when they received the applications, they received 3 times that in terms of just requests. And that's not even meaning that those requests were meeting all the needs, because congregate shelter does not work for all types of folks who are unsheltered. It does not work for families. It does not work for people who have medical needs and need a more private space to exist. It also doesn't acknowledge that we are going to be in this reality at least for 2 to 3 more years while we build slowly more housing. We can't make housing go up overnight. And so it's short-sighted in terms of really understanding the conditions for which we have led ourselves to, because we haven't built enough housing for decades at this point in the state, and we have a lot of work to do around affordability, which are 2 of the critical conditions of what force people into homelessness.
Oh, and I mean, the cost of housing is just obscene, actually. I mean, it's incredible. I don't know how you're going to possibly think you're going to build, this state is going to build enough quote-unquote affordable housing. And
that's not even, I mean, but part of it is also just the high cost of construction right now. But on top of it, then how do you maintain and not only maintain, but how do you require more housing to stay affordable in the long term?
You know, one of the words you used before, and I mentioned the 7 Days story, and it was used in that article too, where you were quoted as talking about how we in Burlington here need to adapt to this new reality. And there was a lot of pushback on that, and people were saying, I don't want to adapt to this new reality, and that's not the right way for you to look at it. How do you respond to that?
Well, adaptation is not an acceptance of this being the status quo. Adaptation is rising to the occasion of acknowledging challenges and acknowledging, as I was describing with our hotspot strategy, that we have to try new ways of finding solutions. We have to innovate. We have to challenge old assumptions. But we also have to embrace the fact that Burlington is not on an island. There's a lot of system failure all around us. There's a lot of larger trends that are much stronger than just what Burlington has control over around hiring trends with police officers and firefighters, for example. Larger trends around the affordability crisis that's this entire state, the opioid crisis we've talked about. It's adapting to understand the complexities of that and then work within the areas that we do have control of, but that we also have influence in. And that goes back to again, state government. This city has never had a coordinated legislative presence and approach to working on state level policy. And at least for the last 4 years, as I've been a state legislator, we have been delivered an agenda by the prior administration that was not co-developed, that was not coordinated in ways where the Burlington delegation, let alone any Chittenden County coordination, was really pushing all in the same direction. And without that, I think that again is a disservice to the people of Burlington and Chittenden County in the State House, because we're not able to really talk about the disparate impact that a lot of these system failures are having on the state's biggest city. And the state's biggest city is a major economic driver in this state. And one of the quarrels I have with the governor is that about a year or so ago, he set up a framing which was very problematic with urban versus rural, that we had to focus a lot on rural communities and their needs. And that should never be squared that way, because we are in this truly together, and the success and well-being of Burlington is intertwined with the rest of the state. And to sort of make that bifurcation is problematic, because then it starts to ignore the needs here in the city of Burlington.
But you know this. I mean, for forever, I mean, I've been here 40 years, it's always been the joke of, there's Burlington and the rest of Vermont. And that just plays right on that.
And it's time to change. It's time to change that attitude. I grew up in central Vermont, and we have way too much at stake, and all these challenges are so intertwined for us not to start working together and see ourselves as one state.
So are you saying, when you use the word adapt, you're not saying that we need to accept that?
100%. We are not accepting. Accepting and adapting are two different words with two different definitions. And adapting is it's smarter, it's strategic, it's thinking about assessing things with, again, data and evidence. It's trying new solutions and innovating, as I was saying before. Accepting is very passive. It's a sort of shrugging and I don't want to say giving up, but it is a much more passive approach to dealing with these challenges.
When you Google in Burlington, Vermont, crime, the number one story that comes up, do you know what it is?
I don't, but
it's the Bike Thieves of Burlington. And, that's an organization that's done some really powerful work. But on the one hand, it's great that they're doing this. On the other hand, to me, that's a system failure. If you've got private citizens out there riding around looking for stolen bikes, would you agree with that?
Well, on one hand, I do appreciate that people are trying to lean in and help, because I see that as the driver for many of those folks. I've met with the bike recovery folks, and I do appreciate the work they're doing. On the other hand, I agree with you. It should not be left to private residents to be filling a role of government. And I also sometimes worry around the liability and the safety concerns for those individuals engaging in with folks who might have stolen a bike for whatever reasons, because folks aren't necessarily trained. They're not necessarily trained in de-escalation and ways to engage with folks. So we have to have better alternatives for folks. Now, the other side of that is that we need to be better utilizing and having a more effective community safety system, and we're not doing that quite yet, which is why that's my primary goal. And back to Ingrid Jonas, is one of the things that I'm asking her to figure out is how do we deliver community safety so that we have people, the right people, to send to you with a type of call. A police officer shouldn't be the one responding necessarily to a bike theft. That could be a different part of our community safety response. I also want to make sure folks know, again, that we have a victim services fund. So when someone's car or bike or work tool set, I hear these stories all the time in the Old North End, Facebook groups and elsewhere, that when someone's livelihood, be it their car to get to work or their tools to be a construction worker or their bike even to commute to work gets stolen, that's disruptive. And so how do we make sure that the rest of city government is also integrated in that response, which you're not going to get when you have just private residents filling a void?
That bike recovery program helped you and your family. How did you feel as someone who had a bike stolen and taken and has now been recovered?
Well, that's why I have appreciation on one hand. So our bike did get stolen, but by the time I reached out within the hour of the neighbor noticing that it was gone, the bike recovery folks had already found the bike. So I think what that also is important, back to telling an accurate story, that bike was less than 2 blocks from our house. It had already been abandoned. And I do appreciate that people found it, brought it to a secure location until we could go back and pick it up. But it wasn't damaged, and it wasn't resold or anything like that. And so I think it's part of this is just making sure that we accurately understand what's going on when people are taking bikes, and figuring out how can the city again lean in a little bit more to be part of that recovery and reunification process. But I also, I think we want to make sure that we understand our priorities of needs too, right? And we only have so many resources, and I want to make sure that we have a stronger priority response plan. I think it's time to review that in more detail. That's the plan that the city's been operating under around what kind of calls do they send police officers to, et cetera. I think we really need to adjust to make sure we're rising to what's happening in 2024, to make sure people are getting the kind of responses, and that we're not that we're using our existing staff, again, adapting in the most effective and efficient way.
How long can Burlington live with having an officer count in the mid-60s?
Well, that is why it is, I met with every single one of my department heads. I have 18 of them, and we set annual goals for the year. And that is the number one goal for our police chief, Chief Murad, is to work on recruitment. Because we can't maintain it. As I mentioned before, I'm very concerned about morale in our police officer ranks, that we're overworking folks, that we're spending way too much on overtime for that matter. And that's too much to ask of our police force. And so we need to innovate here, and we need to make sure that we're trying additional ideas to get folks to apply for officer jobs here, that we have a robust applicant pool that we can draw good candidates from. But then on the other side of it, we've got to be able to retain not only our existing staff, but these new folks once they come on board. So that's the number one goal, and it's the number one expectation I have for our chief of police.
But why, here's what I wonder. Why would, if everybody's having a police shortage, why would I want to work in the city of Burlington when I could work somewhere else in a suburb where I'm less likely to be dealing with major drug dealers, shootings like the one across the street here? What's the appeal for me to become a Burlington police officer?
Well, there is activity happening all over the state. So it's not as if there's, as I mentioned before, there's not like there's no gun violence or...
Okay, but there's a lot more here in the
city. Sure. Well, we are a modern day city. Yeah. So part of this is also people, and we want the right kind of officers as well, because we want people who want to engage in a modern day city, both the challenging sides of it, but also there's a great opportunity to work in a diverse city, to work in a community that is really... innovating in other ways. We are a great employer. We have a really healthy salary and benefits package, of course, as well. But I want people to be proud about working for the Queen City. And part of that is making sure that we are supporting employees in other ways besides salary and benefits. So really thinking about the morale of the city workforce, and that we're really thinking about serving this community and working collaboratively together to really innovate and have a modern day police force that's can get us to a place of community-based policing. That's something that we don't have the staffing to yet, but I want to attract officers who want to be part of that kind of response where you're able to have community policing. There's many different variations, but basically you would have a regular beat, a region of the city you would be assigned to be able to really build relationships and to do that deeper level of community safety work that is really attractive to folks who want to be in an urban city. You're not going to get that same experience in a small town in Vermont.
Or being able to walk on Church Street like it used to be. And don't worry, I'm not going to apply for a job as a Burlington police officer. Let's maybe end here on a positive note. So what has gone better than you expected in the past 6 months?
Well, one thing that has gone better than expected is my working relationship with the City Council, and specifically I just want to appreciate City Council President Ben Travers. We did not know each other very well before I became mayor, and one of the things that has been a very welcomed moment is that we have worked really well together. He's a Democrat, I'm a progressive. We both keenly want to lead this city forward in a way that brings it to a positive place. And he is a great collaborator. He communicates well. We have a really good working relationship. And that has been really invaluable in these first 6 months to make sure that we have the legislative branch of city government and the executive branch working in the same direction. And sure, we can have policy disagreements here and there, but it's a lot easier to have disagreements when you have a really strong working relationship where there's trust and where there is common value alignment around having a functional government that's here around working for the people.
Do you feel that way about all the Democrats on the city council, or just the president?
Well,
because they seem to call you out on a resolution recently about sort of there's not been enough being done.
Well, it's a work in progress with some of them, and as folks, your listeners will know, one of the city councilors, Joan Shannon, ran against me for mayor. So, but I will also say that it's not just one issue. I can find common ground. I've been in policy work and elected work long enough, 15, 20 years now, to know that part of being a successful policymaker and elected person is be able to find common ground on more issues than not. And so while sometimes the politics flares, I am a steady leader who wants to make sure that we focus on the policy work and not the politics. So what I try to offer in those council meetings is being as transparent as possible about what we are doing, and that the politics will not help us move this city forward into a positive place. And what we saw in 4 different public safety resolutions that the Democratic caucus brought forward is that we were already hard at work on, if not most everything that was included in those resolutions. And we were able to find common ground once the Democrats were able to slow down and be able to ask the questions that perhaps they should have asked before they introduced the resolutions. But we were able to find common ground because that is what democracy is at its best and what we need to do to service of the people of Burlington.
Last question. How do you and what do you do to change the perception of people who say downtown Burlington itself is not safe, and I'm thinking about going somewhere else?
Well, part of what will help with community safety as well is if the community returns to itself, meaning if people come downtown and take up the space as well. So when I've heard from businesses that are mostly locally owned here in downtown Burlington that they need folks to engage and come downtown, all the negative behavior that sometimes people associate right now with Burlington, it starts to dissipate when people actually take more space downtown. When there's, as I mentioned before, a family weekend with all of the UVM families visiting, you did not see as many folks sort of who were having sort of either criminal tendencies or mental health issues. They start to kind of move away from the center city area when people take space and build community downtown. And this is a moment to kind of show up for Burlington and to show up for not only the local businesses but for the community itself. itself. And it's for people who live here in Burlington as well to also come into its downtown. We all have a role to play, and even if your small role is to come, maybe perhaps in the middle of Saturday, down to a festival or to an event downtown, that is the best way for us to start to rebuild community and to make a larger, safer community.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
The 802 News Podcast is sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.